See, that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity, because obviously if he was, then that is a miracle, and then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it? So it's at the crux of it. From the text of the New Testament, then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that actually happened?
Great question, Piers. And the honest answer is, upbringing does a lot of the heavy lifting here. If Wesley Huff had been born in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Pakistan, we wouldn't be hearing about the overwhelming reliability of the resurrection. We'd be hearing about the overwhelming reliability of Islamic tradition. Same confidence, same certainty, different miracle. The resurrection isn't accepted because of uniquely strong evidence. It's accepted because it's the miracle you grow up with, the story your society treats as sacred, and the conclusion you're expected to reach before you ever examine the data. Well, let's see if he actually has evidence.
Yeah, I think we do, Pierce, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So the big proof for the resurrection is the New Testament telling us the resurrection happened, written by believers, for believers, with the explicit goal of convincing people to believe. We will get to that later. Now, I do realize how Christian apologists love saying multiple independent sources, as if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are 4 totally separate eyewitness news outlets. In reality, most critical scholars agree Matthew and Luke heavily copied from Mark. So when the same story shows up 3 times, it's not 3 independent confirmations. It's one source getting reposted twice. Once you strip that down, what are we left with? Mark and John. 2. That's really what we have in a historical sense. Weak reports can sometimes support each other, but if they're severely weak, stacking them doesn't fix the problem. It just gives you a taller pile of weak reports. So the idea that we have this rock-solid, cross-checked historical foundation starts to look generous. The two-source hypothesis has been the predominant source theory for the synoptic problem for almost a century and a half. Originally conceived in Germany by C.H. Weiss in 1838, the two-source hypothesis came to dominate German Protestant scholarship after the fall of the Tübingen School, with H.J. Holtzmann's endorsement of a related variant in 1863. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Oxford School brought the two-source hypothesis to English scholarship, culminating in B.H. Streeter's 1924 treatment of the synoptic problem. Now, the two-source hypothesis commands the support of most biblical critics from all continents and denominations.
But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels.
Yes, religious texts can contain history. No one is denying that. The problem is, when the single most important miracle in human history is supported the same way you'd support, there was a guy named Paul who traveled a lot. If God's grand plan is to torture people forever for not believing this, you'd think he'd help a little. Like, just a bit. Maybe by leaving behind something like a contemporary Roman report saying, "Yes, we executed this man, and somehow he came back." An official execution log noting that a crucified criminal's tomb was found empty. A legal record of guards being interrogated over a missing corpse. Eyewitness testimonies written close to the event by people whose names we actually know. Physical evidence examined by people who didn't already worship the guy. Cross-examinations where witnesses are challenged instead of just believed because they sound confident. Instead, we get Luke saying, "I investigated everything carefully," and then immediately going silent on how. No sources, no names, no method. No way to question him on why he doesn't bother to actually convince us. No way to ask follow-up questions. Not even his real name. Now compare that to Islamic Hadith methodology, where Muslim scholars distinguish between 2 things, history and doctrine. If a Hadith talks about something mundane like how many soldiers were in a battle, scholars are relatively relaxed. Fine, humans miscount. Memory slips. No eternal consequences. But if a hadith affects doctrine, worship, what's allowed or forbidden, then the standards go through the roof. Strong chains, named transmitters, cross-checking, skepticism by default. The logic is simple. Stories that affect your eternal fate are not treated the same as trivia. By that standard, the resurrection is not just a historical event. It's a courtroom-level claim with infinite consequences. Every juror should have their skepticism dialed to maximum. And if the evidence doesn't meet that bar, that's not the skeptic's fault. That's a catastrophic failure of the evidence itself.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
You can believe the resurrection on faith. That's your right. But don't downgrade the burden of proof and call it history. When hell is on the line, trust me, bro, doesn't cut it.
And so it's a historical question, Pierce, in the sense that we have to account for what is the best inference to the explanation of this particular thing happening. And I would contend that given the historical data that we can look at, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to explain this from a historical perspective. And that when we do so and we look at the independent testimonies that all intersect on this particular event, we actually, the best explanation to that is that this event actually did take place.
And they don't solve the problem that no matter what you say about your evidence for the resurrection, based on sources written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, based on this evidence from decades later, you still have an account of somebody rising from the dead that is the one time this has ever happened in the history of the universe, and saying it is far more probable than somebody came up with a story about it. Okay. But, oh yeah, well, you can't use that argument. That's warmed over Hume. No, that's wrong. This is how we do history. We decide what most probably happened in the past. And if you tell me that because somebody living 50, 60 years later said Jesus got raised from the dead, that's better evidence that he got raised from the dead than some other evidence, even though resurrection from the dead happened once in the history of the universe, that's more probable than something that happened millions of times every day. Okay, well, I can't help you with your logic.